Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to the A24 project here on the Nerd Party Network, where me and Dallas King make our way through the A24 filmography and interview the talent involved along the way. In this episode, we have an interview with Teddy Blanks, a title designer whose portfolio of work includes A24 favourites Lady Bird, Hereditary, Midsummer, The Farewell, The Lighthouse, and the upcoming Green Knight and Zola. Teddy takes us behind the scenes in developing title designs for these A24 films, and the collaboration involved with directors like Greta Gerwig, Aster, and Robert Eggers. His work beyond A24 includes some of my favourite films of the past few years too, so this was a really exciting interview for me. Thanks to Teddy for joining me, and I hope you too will enjoy the show. Teddy, before you've turned this into an amazing career, what was your creative design journey to turning it into a professional one?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I studied graphic design in college in Richmond, Virginia at VCU, and I moved to New York sort of right afterwards. I worked at a small graphic design studio in Northwest Connecticut for a couple of years for these two kind of design luminaries, Jessica Helfand and her late husband, Bill Drentel. They were kind of my design parents and sort of taught me how a small studio was run. And then when I came back to New York after that, I started my studio, Chips, that I run with my partners, Adam Squires and Dan Shields. And we've been running this studio for about 10 years. But in terms of doing film titles specifically, I mean, I was always a huge movie buff and always wanted to make movies and wanted to work in the movie industry in some way. And it was kind of, in college that I kind of figured out, doing maybe as a designer, I could work on films by doing the titles. And it was really meeting Lena Dunham sort of before she did Girls and before she really blew up, and working on a lot of her early short films and becoming friends with her, and then doing titles for her movie Tiny Furniture, which then a lot of people ended up seeing, that kind of got my foot in the door of doing film titles. And just the success of that movie sort of led to me doing other titles, and it kind of snowballed throughout the years.
What were sort of the films, shows that sort of inspired your kind of creative eye, where you thought, I love that title, oh, I wonder how that one was kind of designed? Was there any that sort of stood out for you over the years?
I mean, so many that stood out for me. I think the first time I probably noticed the film title as being a thing, as being kind of its own sort of exciting part of the movie was, as a kid growing up in the 80s and 90s when all of the big blockbuster films had these very recognizable logos. I mean, you think about sort of like The Terminator or Back to the Future, or even Disney movies like Beauty and the Beast and The Little Mermaid, and they have these intricate logos that have, are sort of 3D and have this, shading on them. And I later found out a lot of those logos were done by the same person. Her name is Nina Saxon. She did those Disney logos. And then, in college, when I started watching a lot of movies and getting into Hitchcock movies and simultaneously studying graphic design and learning about Saul Bass, who's, thought of as the kind of grandfather of title design. He did a lot of those Hitchcock movies that have the famous, really graphic title sequences like Psycho, North by Northwest, Vertigo. And this is about the time it kind of entered my brain that doing titles for movies was a job that a person could have. So that's kind of, how I kind of first got turned on to doing film titles. And then, as far as now, like things that inspire my creative eye, I try to take inspiration from anywhere I can outside of film titles. Because I think if you're just sort of looking back at film history and trying to do titles that have already been done before, you're not going to come up with anything new. So I look at a lot of vintage type catalogs, I look at a lot of art history, I look at old books whose subject matter might have something to do with the movie I'm working on, stuff like that.
I always thought it was just like, film fans like me and yourself that were interested in like the fonts and designs of titles. And then you sort of see like, I think like a couple of years ago, I started to see places like Art of the Title becoming more prominent and people referencing it, sharing it, diving into sort of these film titles and designs. It's been quite amazing to discover it's not just a niche thing. It seems to be something that a lot of people are really invested in when they sort of are looking at films, whether it's the most recent releases or people diving into sort of the type font of Wes Anderson films, for example.
It definitely seems to be something that people are more aware of now. And I think Art of the Title, the website that you mentioned, has a lot to do with that. It's such an incredible resource, and they have so many long-form interviews with title designers and directors about title sequences. And I mean, that's a site I kind of breathlessly await their latest feature, and I look back to it for inspiration a lot. And, I even see now, like a lot of the directors I work with will send me links to Art of the Title and to show me vintage titles that they like and, references that they want me to kind of piggyback off of. So I think you're totally right that it's something that people are thinking a lot more about these days than maybe any other time in the past.
For those who aren't kind of familiar with you and your work, what's like a kind of traditional day in your job as it can be, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on how many projects I have going on at the moment and what the status of each project is. At the beginning of working on film titles, the first stage is sort of like coming up with ideas, discussing those ideas with the director. But that stage is very different from the end stage, which is the delivery of the film titles to the post-production house, which is much more technical and involves like sizing things at the right pixel size and aspect ratio and getting the files to the DI. That's the part that kind of like hurts my head the most, because my heart is with the creative stage of it, but then there's you have to get good at both. Where things get hairy, where the days can the traditional day or typical day in my job can get kind of stressful, is when I have multiple projects going on at the same time. I'm working on 2 or 3 movies. Each movie is kind of at a different stage. There's one that I'm just starting out, coming up with ideas. There's another one that I'm doing revisions for the director, and then there's another one that I'm delivering. I mean, this has happened before, and then I'm kind of bouncing around, trying to go from a creative headspace to a technical headspace, which is difficult. So, it's hard because of the nature of movies and schedules are always changing. It's hard to really time it out. So, okay, I can really focus these days on just being totally creative and coming up with ideas. And then these days I know I'm going to be kind of dealing with the post house. But, you try to do that as much as you can so that you don't go crazy.
You've worked on a range of A24 films, a lot of the most kind of popular ones: Lady Bird, Hereditary, Midsummer, The Farewell, The Lighthouse, and kind of the forthcoming The Green Knight and Zola. What was your sort of first film of theirs that you kind of worked on, and what was that experience like?
Yeah, it's interesting. The first movie I did titles for A24 was Lady Bird, but I had some experience working on some earlier films. Back in 2015, my partner, Dan Shields, who is a web developer, he and I, and this is before I used to work with Adam and Dan, my 2 partners, on web design, and I sort of don't really do that work anymore because I've kind of transitioned to full-time film title work. They still do a lot of beautiful websites, but Dan and I, we got a call from A24, and they had this VOD deal at the time with DirecTV. You guys probably know all about this, where they were releasing some movies not theatrically, but just sort of, or maybe they did a small theatrical release, but they did it sort of day and date releases. And these movies were like Cut Bank, Barely Lethal, Slow West, Dark Places. It was all in that 2015, 2016, in those 2 years. And they, at the same time, this was also a thing. I don't know if you remember, there were these sort of expensive, like beautifully designed microsites for a lot of these movies. I remember specifically, the one for Ex Machina was really cool, and I think they did a really cool one for While We're Young as well. And we wanted to get into that business with them, is doing these cool websites for movies. But for these VOD DirecTV releases, they had much lower budgets to make the websites, and what we did is make them a WordPress backend that they could reuse for each of these releases. It sort of never actually led to doing kind of a cool custom microsite to one of their bigger releases, but it was kind of a fun thing to do anyway. So that was my first experience with A24, was making these small microsites for those movies in 2015. And then it was when Greta Gerwig approached me to do the titles for Lady Bird that was the first time I actually worked on a movie that they released.
If we kind of take Lady Bird as sort of an example, because you've got this fantastic, I don't even know the exact word to describe it, but this like portfolio of the work that you did on Lady Bird. What's the kind of sort of time frame from Greta Gerwig, for example, coming and speaking to you, going, we'd like you to pitch for this, or these are some of our ideas, to this is us checking out, we've done our work. How long would you sort of typically work on a film like Lady Bird, for example, and what would be the process from start to finish?
Well, Lady Bird's a bit of an anomaly because I've known Greta for a long time. She had, shared the script for Lady Bird with me back when she first wrote it. I loved it. And then when she was looking to raise money for the film, this is long before A24 was even involved, this was 2015, I think she asked if I would help her put together a sort of like a pitch deck, essentially, like an online pitch deck. It was actually a small website for the movie that she could kind of send around to potential investors. So she came over to my office one weekend with a big pile of memorabilia from when she was in high school, a yearbook, class schedule, photos, all of this stuff that kind of, put you in that early 2000s era when the movie takes place. And we scanned a bunch of it and made this online pitch deck. And at the time, not thinking this would end up actually being the look for the film, I made this title treatment out of a kind of old blackletter font because it felt biblical, and this is a movie about her going to a Catholic school, and that was the font that was kind of on the main page of the pitch deck website. Fast forward a couple of years later, once she actually had a cut of the film to show, she was interested in working with me on the titles, but also the artist Leanne Shapton, who, in addition to writing several books, she had also done the beautiful hand-painted titles for Noah Baumbach's Squid and the Whale, and I think Greta wanted to get some of that, tactile, handmade quality of Leanne's work into the titles as well. So it ended up being this kind of collaboration where Leanne and I came up with a bunch of ideas for the titles. Some of them were things that Leanne had just sort of painted herself and then sent me, and I scanned them and arranged them on the screen. Some of them were things where I would design a kind of type layout, send the digital files to Leanne, she would paint them, and then send them back to me. I would scan them and then show those to Greta. And then, after this sort of long process, we eventually landed on nothing really kind of had that iconic quality like that original title treatment I had made for the case study. So Leanne made a very beautiful hand-painted version of that, and that is what ended up in the movie. And I don't know if that's just because it was the best thing we came up with, or if it was just because it was the thing that, it had now been connected to the movie in some form or fashion. It was I think it was like she had it on the slate when she was directing the movie. It was like a font treatment that she had kind of, I think in her mind was so tied to the film at that point that it was hard to let go of. So that ended up being the thing that Leanne painted. And then Leanne and I also worked together to create an alphabet for the rest of the titles that we then passed over that hand-painted alphabet to A24, and they used it in the marketing materials as well.
One of the things that's kind of stood out for me, I remembered sort of last year, I think it was probably my first real introduction to people discussing your work online, was your second collaboration with Greta Gerwig, which was Little Women, where there was, I can't remember if someone had posted, it was one of these sorts of viral tweets that just catch the eye, where it's like, I think it was the Little Women font that was chosen for the film, and it was like oh, this has kind of been pulled from, I think it was a certain book edition for it, and everyone was really amazed at sort of the kind of this film connection. They sort of looked at the font and went, oh, that's interesting, but never quite realised the origin until sort of, I think, someone put it together. What was it like working on the Little Women project? It seems a really interesting one to kind of work on, especially something that's got such a rich literary history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should say the main title for Little Women, as it's used in the film, is just a shot of the book cover, which is the first edition Little Women printing, and it's, you know, I think it's genuine. It is that original edition of Little Women. I think maybe they remade a version for the movie that has the character's name as the author on the book instead of the author's name, which is kind of a fun little Easter egg. But that was, you know, shot by Greta for the film before it came out. So that actually had nothing to do with my work. I think on that tweet thread, I was just sort of telling people what the origin of it was because I happen to know what the origin of it was. But in terms of my work on Little Women, I was brought in fairly early to see a cut of the movie, and I think it's because, you know, the film takes place on two timelines, almost like a Christopher Nolan movie, and Greta and her editor, Nick Hoy, wanted my advice about, well, how much do we want to telegraph to the audience what's happening here? Like, how much do we want to hold their hand and walk them through it? Specifically, do we want to use titles every time we cut back to a different timeline? Do we want to have a big title on the screen that says, you know, 7 years earlier, 7 years later? Do we want to have it say the actual year that this bit is taking place? Does it say 1873 here? You know, and so I took a look at the movie, and my opinion was sort of like, it should have as few titles as possible, I think, because it is bouncing back and forth often enough that if you did a title every single time, it would be slightly distracting. So I think we tried out a bunch of stuff and ended up with just one title that said 7 years earlier, the first time it cuts back. And I think that was right. I think that was the right decision. And you know, I think some people do have trouble with the timeline thing in the movie, but I sort of think it's like a fun mystery, even if you don't realize, you know, exactly what they're doing until half an hour in. I think it's fun once you do. Once it connects to you, like, oh, we're seeing them as, you know, in their early adult life, and then in their sort of teenage life and life as children. So I think that's fun. So that was when I was first brought on pretty early to discuss that. And then, like I said, the main title was already just the shot of the book that they had made. So then the question was just finding the right font, you know, for the rest of the credits. And I just thought, like everything else in the movie, it should be as authentic as possible. And so I went and looked at a bunch of type specimen books from the 19th century, and I've, you know, created an alphabet based on a typeface that essentially there's no real digital version of. So it really sort of belongs to the movie, and that way, like, you can't go and buy that font and use it. You would have to get it from me. And, you know, I showed Greta, I think, a handful of those typefaces, these kind of special 19th century fonts that I really loved, and she chose the one that's in the movie, and it was a pretty easy process just making it after that choice was made.
Another director you've worked with several times is Aster on Hereditary and Midsommar, and the work on Midsommar has become hugely popular. I mean, I'm recording this interview and I've got a Midsommar, one of those, the Japanese design poster in the corner of my room with your font type on it, which is quite surreal to me to be talking to you with your kind of your work in the corner. What's it kind of like been working on these projects with Ari Aster, and sort of the evolution of kind of this design, where it seems to become, Midsommar seems to have inspired so many different people on places like Etsy, Redbubble, kind of creatively. What's it like to have been involved in something like that too?
Well, I love working on both of those movies, specifically because the ideas, I'm very proud of the ideas that I came up with for both title sequences. I should be clear, I did not have anything to do with the marketing of those movies, and the title treatment that is in the film itself is although it's similar to what they use for the marketing, I think what they use for the marketing is a bit flashier. It has a bit more style than the one in the movie itself, to be honest. The one in the movie itself is a fairly simple, straightforward kind of serif typeface that its only, real connection to the film itself is that it was designed by a Swedish font designer. But the kind of thing I came up with at the last minute was basically because, we had looked at a bunch of different titles. Some were a little more expressive and kind of horror movie-ish, and I think Ari really just wanted to go with something simple and beautiful for the end titles, and that's what we just had, which was sort of white titles over black. And I really wanted to push it forward because I was so proud of what we had come up with for Hereditary. I thought Midsummer should be special as well. So at the very last minute, before delivering the titles, essentially, I came up with the idea of having the blossoming flowers in the letters themselves. And so I sort of quickly went and found a bunch of slow motion footage of flowers as they were blooming, and I comped them up inside of 2 or 3 of the titles, and I sent them over to Ari, and I was like, what do you think about this? Why don't we do, I think this could really add an extra, special something to the titles. And he, immediately latched onto it. And then it was just a matter of, finding enough flowers to really round out the entire sequence.
Two of the obviously kind of best films I thought of last year were sort of The Lighthouse and The Farewell. With The Lighthouse, for example, another film you worked on, we had Robert Eggers on here before, and he's someone who is incredibly detailed with design books that really dive into the history of whatever period he's working on. What's it like when you work with someone like that that's got such a clear vision, so much detail and information? Are you able to sort of add to something like that, or do they come to you with a very kind of clear idea of what they want and it's sort of about complementing that?
Yeah, with Robert Eggers in particular, definitely the vision was there. I mean, he designed all of the titles for The Witch himself. I think he came to me for... Actually, I should shout out the post-production supervisor of The Lighthouse and Ari Aster's movies. His name is Jeffrey Penman, and he brought me onto... And he's also a producer on those movies, and he brought me onto all 3 of those movies. And, I was brought onto The Lighthouse specifically because... I think Eggers realized he didn't have the time to make the titles himself. That movie. There was just too many moving parts and too many things for him to deal with to actually be mired in the specifics of actually creating the titles. But he had already found a book from the 1850s called The Lighthouse and taken the type from the title page, and that is the title treatment of The Lighthouse. So he had already found that, and what I did really was just trying to figure out the best way to take that look that he loved and had already set for the film and extend it for the rest of the titles. So I kind of proud of my detective work here. I sort of looked at that. I found that book, a scan of that book on Google Books that he took the title treatment from, and I looked at the name of the publisher, and then I searched for every book I could find in the 1850s from that same publisher, and with the thought that, well, they probably used the same metal type to make all of their title pages, which turned out to be the case. They had the exact same font on all their title pages. So I was able to create a full alphabet, not only a full alphabet, but with multiple versions of each A, B, C, D, E, because every piece of metal type is going to hit the page slightly differently, and you're going to get a slightly kind of distressed, old book looking letter. So I wanted to get as many different versions of each letter as possible. So I went through every single book they publish, I think between 1840 and 1860, and got a screenshot of every single title page, and then I used that to create the alphabet that I used to make the rest of the titles.
It's funny when you mentioned sort of The Witch there. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. I know it's been something that people seem to... It's been years obviously since The Witch came out, and people are still discussing it and debating it. The film is obviously The Witch, but people sort of based on the title font call it The Witch, based on sort of that. What's it like for yourself when sort of you see people will, I suppose we all just think of it's just getting the title up there. But I suppose things like that can sometimes cause a debate. It has people kind of thinking your film can maybe be called something else entirely. what's it kind of like when for you as a sort of a title designer, when there's that kind of debate and discussion around something? Does that make you think something's been a success, or maybe it's not kind of done the correct job, or is that just the internet these days where everyone's got an opinion on something or has to take a different angle on what an actual title of a film is?
Wait, are you saying people actually think it's called The Witch?
Yeah, there have been people. I'm sure there's discussions on Reddit about it still. Like, there are people that will stick with it being called The Witch. And I know one or two. I won't name and shame them just now, but if they're listening, they'll know.
I do think it speaks to the, iconic look of that title treatment that it sparked some kind of debate. But I will say that I know for sure that the reason Eggers designed the title that way was because in that era, that is how you would have done a W. I mean, the sort of letter W didn't exist in the same way that we know it, and you would have spelled out the word witch using two V's next to one another. I mean, that's in the era that the movie took place. I think he's very, he wants to be very era specific with things, and that is how he accomplished it on The Witch. But the pronunciation of that title is 100% The Witch.
I'm glad you've got my back on this one. I can always refer to an expert in this field next time that debate comes up. With the Farewell, for example, it's a film that's largely shot and based in China. It's spoken in another language. How do you sort of approach something like The Farewell? Do you kind of base it around where the kind of film is going to be set? Or is this thinking like, well, this is a film that's financed in America? How do you sort of go around creating something for The Farewell? It seems like a very interesting kind of project and something that's a little bit different too.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the director, Lulu Wang, was, very clear from our first discussion that this is not a Chinese film. It's a film about a Chinese American that goes to China. And even though a lot of the movie was not in English, she did not want American audiences to approach it as a foreign film. And the titles, had to tie into that, even though the titles are in two languages. So the challenge there is, it's twofold. It's one, kind of making sure that even though you have both languages there and they're basically the same size, they're kind of different colors. The titles that are the Chinese translations are in one color, and the English titles are in another color. And it's trying to find two alphabets from two different languages that kind of pair well together and look nice together. Feel like they're kind of the sort of version of each other. But it's always a challenge to design for a language you don't read yourself, especially when the alphabet itself is different, different shaped characters. I mean, I don't know when I'm doing it if the font I'm using for the non-English words is like the Chinese version of Comic Sans. I need someone else to tell me that. So that's, part of that was just continually running the titles by the the people who worked on the movie that could, read them, and making sure that everything was looked right and looked as nice as I thought they looked from my slightly untrained eye. So yeah, I think that was a bit of a challenge to kind of figure out, even though the titles themselves are very simple.
With something like subtitles, for example, is it a case that, as I say, you provide sort of the font and kind of design for it, and then another team will go off and actually create the subtitles for the entire film? Is that kind of how that handoff kind of works, or do you sort of have more involvement?
It depends. I mean, there are some movies that I've designed, the main and end titles for, where I haven't done the subtitles at all, just somebody else. Either they use what they kind of did in the Avid, or they have someone at the post-production facility make them. And then, yes, in many cases I have made essentially a template for people to use. So it's kind of like, here's the parameters, here's a Photoshop file. If you just type the font is already loaded up. If you just type what the subtitle is here, I've already got all the settings so that it should look exactly how it should look, and then you just save it out and put it in the movie, and that way I can kind of do the initial look of it, and then someone else can run with that. And then I've worked on other movies where I designed every single subtitle in the film. I mean, it really just has to do with what they ask me for and what they have the budget for. I mean, it's kind of my opinion, like, at some point that becomes such a technical process. It's just sort of like once you set the look, it's like typing in every line that they need translated. It's not something a lot of people really need me for. There's no reason to pay me to do that when I think essentially anyone who could open up a Photoshop file can do it.
I know I'm excited for the Green Knight and Zola. What's it been like for yourself to sit on these really exciting kind of projects where I can imagine, based on sort of the trailer alone for the Green Knight, that was a really exciting kind of project to work on. It had such an interesting kind of title font. How's it been for you knowing these films are in kind of limbo just now, that you've got some amazing work that the world is waiting to see potentially?
Yeah, I mean, both are great movies. I mean, very different movies, but, you know, The Green Knight is really incredibly beautiful, totally weird. It's got that, you know, I mean, that special kind of look and vibe that only David Lowery can do. And then, you know, Zola is just it's so fun. And I think Janixa Bravo is an incredible talent. I think what she did with that story, you know, it's moving, it's hilarious, it's like the sound design is really interesting and cool. So yeah, I mean, I'm definitely excited for people to see both of them and see my work in them. I should also say the font that's in the trailer for The Green Knight and the poster has nothing to do with the titles in the movie, so you'll be interested to see that. And The Green Knight, I'm still working on it. I think one thing that's been interesting with this lockdown is that, you know, David Lowery just took it as an opportunity to open the movie back up and start playing around. So I think the edit has changed significantly since when it was originally supposed to be released. And I think, we just this week, I mean, just yesterday, I sent him a bunch of new stuff. There are I don't know if I'm giving away spoilers, but there are chapter titles that appear throughout the film. That's all I'll say. And you know, so there's a series of just sort of intertitles that happen, and they all had one look and had been delivered, and the movie was sort of finished. And then, you know, he got in touch with me a couple weeks ago and said, you know, I really would like to revisit these. I think they could be weirder and cooler. You know, I said, sure. And so I came up with a bunch of new stuff for it. So yeah, I'm definitely excited for people to see both movies. Zola, the titles are also really fun. Janixa had sort of like Robert Eggers had designed the titles herself for her first feature, Lemon, and in this case, you know, had a very strong idea about which font she wanted to use, and even going to the point that, well, I love this font, but there are a few letters in it that I don't like. She didn't like the Z, so I ended up kind of doing a custom version of the typeface. I redrew the Z, I redrew a few other letters, and I came up with this kind of fun airbrushed quality to the lettering as well. And I'm not 100% sure. I did give some people at A24, they asked for, you know, the kind of custom alphabet I had made for that movie. So the marketing materials haven't come out, but my fingers are crossed that some of my work will end up in those as well.
I'm excited to see The Green Knight. We were joined by David Lowery at the start of lockdown, just sort of after the disappointment of South by Southwest, kind of the premiere kind of being cancelled. And they were like, yeah, the film's kind of nearly good to go. Probably just like, we've got this little bit of extra time now. It's good to know that all these months on, they're still kind of working on it. So I can't wait to see that film eventually. And same with Zola. I listened to a podcast interview with the director and the editor the other day, and it's one of those things. I remembered sort of the news story at the time, but I've kind of pulled myself back. I want to go into that film kind of fresh-eyed and not refreshing myself on what that whole Twitter thread was all about.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to do it. I mean, I think you're going to love both movies. Very different, but very cool movies. And I'm excited myself to, you know, watch them both on a big screen at some point whenever that becomes possible again.
A frequent collaborator for yourself has also been Alex Ross Perry. I mean, Her Smell is one of my kind of favourite films of the past few years, and I would probably say one of my favourite kind of experiences. I remember I was lucky enough to see it in the UK cinemas. They sort of had quite a small rollout here. I remember being just so stressed and anxious, and immediately sort of at the start of that film, you know, before even the credits are sort of rolling, I'm feeling anxious, invested in these kind of characters. What was it like working on that film? Because you've got so many different kind of designs and fonts in that film, from, you know, like the Her Smell kind of title itself, this kind of neon kind of lighting to kind of all the different bands that seem to have been inspired by kind of, your Holes and kind of, musicians of sort of the 90s. What was it like working on Her Smell?
Yeah, it was a blast. I mean, I think it was the fourth movie I've worked on with Alex Ross Perry. And he's one of my favorite collaborators because he really he knows that I can really dig into a subject matter and kind of go as far as I can, and he really trusts me to find the right look for things. So in this case, it was just sort of like, let's make this as cool but also as believable to 90s indie rock band logos and design as possible. So it was really just me looking at every album cover by every female fronted band I could find from that era, and I was involved very early on in the process because they had to have a lot of my materials for when they actually shot the movie. Usually I don't come on until there's already a cut of the movie to see. In this case, everything had to be done before they started shooting. So I was doing all the posters that you see in the background at the venue. There's these large kind of backdrops they have behind the bands as they're playing on stage that have their logo all over it. T-shirts, the logo of the recording studio that's in there, CD covers. And yeah, the main title itself, like you mentioned, is a physical neon sign that was, I had to send to the neon sign manufacturer, and then the production designer picked it up, and then they actually shot it on the set. All that stuff was just really cool to be involved with, in creating a world that deeply. It's interesting you bring up Her Smell, and I'm so glad that you loved it. I mean, I think it's his best movie. I think it's my favorite work I've done for any of his movies. It is the kind of movie that if it had been released by A24 would have made 10 to 15 times as much money as it did at the box office. And I think, for a podcast about A24, it's interesting to talk about this kind of thing because it does A24 does kind of have this monopoly of sort of the, Alex Ross Perry, actually said this to me once, is that it's kind of the Disney of indie film. And I think that's because it had this genius idea that film marketing should be as artful and cool as the films themselves. This is something that seems totally obvious to me, but most film studios and especially most indie film distribution companies kind of botch it, even on great movies. And so, in some cases, the A24 marketing is actually cooler and better than the movies themselves. And I think that's why it's had this kind of lasting quality. Like even, sort of like Miramax in the 90s, but even cooler than that somehow. I think about this all the time with Alex's movies. Like especially Her Smell, like if Her Smell had been released by A24, like I just think it would be a phenomenon in a way that it, unfortunately, not as many people have seen it, I think, than should have.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones. I know I've spoken with several friends that when we've kind of spoken about it, it's like, it's one of those films you go on and tell other people you've got to go check it out, or I remember sort of a few weeks ago, I think it was like a Friday evening, and I think iTunes put it up for like $5 for the weekend, and I think I saw so many people on Twitter going, right, this is your chance, go see Her Smell, get it downloaded, get it rented. I think it's such a fantastic film, and I love that about it, where I remembered sort of in that first half an hour thinking, I don't know if I can sustain this level of stress and anxiety with this film. But when you just stay with it, and that's what you go to see films like that in the cinema. I mean, I've watched it at home and I love it, but that's what you kind of go to the cinema, to be pushed into that challenging space as a viewer, and you go through that experience. It's almost like a Disney ride in a way. I just thought it was incredible, and I love that you can even see on, I don't know if they're still available, like you could buy the t-shirts, with obviously the designs, the fonts, etc. It's one of those ones I think it had the potential for to be something that so many more people could love, and I think as years go on, more and more people will find it and wonder why they slept on it.
Oh, I totally agree. I had a very similar experience seeing it in theaters for the first time because like I said, most movies I'm brought on during the post-production process, I have to watch a cut of the movie as part of my job to know what it's about, to get the vibe, to understand, what the director's going for, because I have to know those things before I even start to come up with ideas for what the titles look like. With Her Smell, I designed the title before the movie was even shot, after having read the script and after a lot of conversations about what it should look like with Alex. So when he sent me a cut of the movie, I watched the first 10 minutes and I was like, I'm turning this off. This is too good. This is actually too good. I'm just going to wait and watch it on the big screen. So I did the titles and, designed all that stuff for the movie. And then just like waited until I could actually go see it opening weekend. I'm glad I waited, because I agree. I mean, it's just relentless. The first hour of that movie. It's just like, it's a great experience.
We focus on some of your film work. Is there any other projects that you've worked on that you're proud of, or people are surprised when you mention, oh, I worked on that? What kind of projects have you kind of covered?
Yeah, I mean, I'm proud of a lot of the work that my studio does. Like I said, Dan and Adam, they do a lot of web work for museums and cultural institutions in New York. Adam does some really cool art books, and he and I actually work together on a few different branding projects. For instance, 3 or 4 years ago, we rebranded the National Book Foundation, and so every year we do all of the design work for the National Book Awards, and that's a really fun project. Partially just because that's kind of a cool elite cultural institution and fun to be involved with, and also partially just because it's fun to work with Adam on something like that. And then I think the thing, weirdly, that if I meet someone and they've actually heard of something I've done, it's not my film work. It's my work on podcast art. Podcast covers like Slow Burn, the first 2 seasons of Slow Burn, and You Must Remember This, Karina Longworth's great movie podcast. And the reason people recognize my name from that is because they say my name in the credits at the end of every episode, and people are much more likely to listen to podcast credits, which last 30 seconds, than they are to actually sit around and watch the entire crawl at the end of the movie until my name pops up.
I found it really hard not to go there when you mentioned Slow Burn, going, I listened to that, and I like the art for that. That's really cool. It's amazing how the world's kind of connected like that. Where I find that amazing.
Oh, it's a great podcast.
I'll have to. Hopefully you approve of our podcast art. Hopefully that's up to scratch.
I love the two ghosts. It's very clever, and I'm glad David Lowery is essentially shouted out on your podcast art.
There is actually someone underneath that ghost as well. Like, most people just think of that.
I need to take a closer look.
There is actually someone underneath the ghost in that. So so that's something not many people know about our little bit of our work as well. I mean, obviously we're kind of talking just now sort of in the COVID kind of lockdown. How have things been for your industry? Is that something that's doing okay just now, sort of in kind of lockdown? Is it able to kind of continue on, while others are perhaps kind of struggling? How have things kind of been for you guys?
Yeah, I've been really lucky. In terms of title design for movies, post-production marches on. A lot of stuff was shot before COVID, and I thankfully kind of signed on to wait. I sort of overloaded my plate at the beginning of this year, so that meant that I had continuing work up until now, and have throughout the past few months signed on to a couple more projects. Yes, I've been very lucky in that I've been able to keep working throughout these months, but it will. There's only so many things they shot before everyone went into lockdown, and it will slow down. And it is slowing down. It's starting to slow down. I definitely have less work now than I did 3 months ago. But I think that's okay. I mean, I feel a little bit overworked, and I know that people are starting to shoot things slowly now again. So I think there will be a fallow period where I probably won't be doing as many film titles, but I'll have other design projects to work on with my partners here, and then hopefully some time to, maybe finally write something myself.
I'm always curious for a designer like yourself. What's it like when you sort of see people's kind of artwork on their walls or in kind of undergrounds, even things like you say sort of slow burn. Like I can imagine being on sort of that morning commute and there's someone tuned into slow burn an episode and you can see that on their phone. Is it surreal for kind of you to sort of see your work out there on people's walls, undergrounds, you know, you name it?
Yeah, definitely surreal. I would say it's only started happening in the past, 2 or 3 years where I've worked on something big enough that it's actually had, outdoor advertising and stuff like that. I mean, and the thing is, I have no control over whether the work I do for the film or the TV series or whatever it is going to end up in the marketing of that thing. Occasionally it does. I mean, for instance, I worked on, Ben Stiller directed this series Escape at Dannemora, and I did a title treatment for that. They ended up using that in all the marketing, and then I would sort of get off the subway and see a big subway poster of that show. I mean, that was very exciting. I mean, I think the most exciting thing was probably I remember being in Times Square. I was on my way to go see a show on Broadway, and there's this gigantic, I think probably the biggest billboard in Times Square is this like rotating Netflix billboard where they, every 30 seconds they play a different trailer and then it turns into the logo and poster of whatever Netflix series they're currently advertising. And this is right around the time Russian Doll was coming out, which is a series that I did titles for. And I just remembered here's Natasha Lyonne's face and my Russian Doll font, like gigantic in Times Square, right as I was like on my way to this Broadway show. I mean, that was probably the most surreal and kind of exciting version of it.
We always pose this kind of question to everyone we get on the show. What are some of the highlights of the A24 filmography for you? Oh God. I mean, I don't know. There's just so many good ones. I mean, there are the obvious kind of stone cold classics like Moonlight, Ex Machina, The Lobster. I think The Souvenir is definitely up there in terms of the recent ones. There are other movies I really loved. Uncut Gems, like going earlier, The Spectacular Now. I was like one of the first ones, and I think that movie was so fun to watch in theaters. First Reformed I really loved. Eighth Grade. And even like I don't know. I remember another one that I saw recently was The Death of Dick Long, which I thought was, it was a totally weird and crazy movie, but I thought it was pretty cool. And then I know people are divided on this one, but Under the Silver Lake I really enjoyed. I love that one too.
Yeah, I think it's kind of slept on. And I recently saw, which has just been on my list for forever, and I don't know why. I was sort of like, whenever it came around time to like thinking of something to watch, I never really did it. But I finally sat down and watched Green Room, and my God, I mean, that movie's so talk about like a relentless nail biter. I mean, that's such a good one too. So yeah, I mean, those are just some. I mean, I think, as you know, there's just so many good ones to talk about.
Is there anything else you'd recommend people that maybe something that you've kind of worked on that if people are still in lockdown, like kind of we are here in the UK and across America at the moment, that people maybe kind of check out or, download or listen to? Is there anything that you'd kind of recommend at the moment that you're enjoying?
Well, I can't think of anything in particular that I've worked on that is sort of new for people to check out, but I can tell you what I've been watching. I just watched a bunch of Ang Lee movies. Kind of the first time I really was considering him as a director, and one that really stood out for me, a movie that I had just kind of never even heard of, which is Ride with the Devil, which is his sort of Civil War epic of sorts, and it just kind of knocked me out. So there's a recommendation.
And for anyone that's kind of listening to this, that obviously this is an audio kind of format, but if you want people to kind of check out your work online, some of your portfolio designs, because as I say, I love that Ladybird one where it really talks through all the different kind of variations, you can remember sort of the splashboard, etc. Where would kind of the best places to people maybe to check you out online or to kind of check out your work?
Yeah, the name of my studio is Chips, and our website is chips.nyc, and you can check out a bunch of our work, from my film title work to our, logo work, to my partner's web work, to books we've designed, the podcast art I mentioned earlier. It sort of runs the gamut. So that's the best place to kind of look at our look at everything we've done for the past 10 years. And it hasn't been updated for about a year and a half, and we hope to change that soon.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about fonts and typeface. It's nice to know that I'm not the only person out there that is really incredibly interested in this unique work, and it's been really fascinating to sort of learn a little bit more about what you do in such a specific and really exciting kind of role.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking to you about it. I rarely get the chance to dive into my work at this detail, so I appreciate you asking me to be on the podcast.